Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, here continuing where we left off in All or Nothing, Systematicity, Transcendental Arguments, and Skepticism in German Idealism by Paul W. Franks. Continuing chapter 1, and let's get on with it. Just a quick recap, I suppose, is the last time we ended with what seems to be the crumbling of Kant's final phase in his pre-critical turn, where he was attempting to unify Leibniz and Newton, and it just started falling apart in various ways, in trying to assert a reality to dynamic community. Kant doesn't know how to really mediate that and relate that to the substances of Leibniz, the monads, in such a way that insofar as we have dynamic community, the explanatory closure of physics does not point itself back to the underlying substantial reality of inherent qualities. Whereas the dynamic community is itself an external set of relations. It's part of the issue of relations and relata. The relata, the related, the things that are actually related, are generally in the West going to be privileged as the real ground of relations. Relations are secondary properties. One would say that relations supervene, I suppose. Or is it? I forget what that term means. No, I think that's the right usage. The relations supervene upon the substances, meaning that they are grounded by the substances and are sort of epiphenomena of kinds of that. Not too sure. I don't like analytic philosophy. Don't take my word for it. Google it. But anyways, so Kant's attempt is falling apart. And now we will see where this goes. So 1.5. Unlike Kant's dissertation account of sensibility, not much of his dissertation account of the understanding survives the revolution and makes its way into the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. As Kant writes to Marcus Hertz in 1772, the dissertation lacks any account whatsoever of the relationship between the understanding and its objects. However, the dissertation already contains hints of two central features of the critical account of the understanding. First, when Kant addresses the tricky question of why, given that phenomena are things as they appear, but as they are not, nonetheless, cognition of them is in the highest degree true. He suggests that there are common laws according to which the agreements of subject and predicate in judgments of phenomena may be assessed. That is to say, the subjective and ideal realm has its own standards of truth. By 1781, this has become the distinction between two meanings of the contrast between the real and the ideal. Space and the physical objects inhabiting it are transcendentally ideal, but empirically real. Second, Kant hints at an intimacy between sensibility and understanding that must come as a surprise within the dualistic context of the dissertation. Namely, quote, "There is a certain concept which in itself indeed belongs to the understanding, but of which the actualization in the concrete requires the auxiliary notions of time and space. This is the concept of number." Unquote. By 1781, this has become a general claim about the pure categories that constitute the heart of Kant's new account of the understanding. The categories belong to the understanding, but their concrete actualizations are possible only by means of what is given to sensibility in the forms of space and time. The developments of the first hint suggests a strengthened tendency towards dualism. The phenomenon has its own standard of reality. But the development of the second suggests a strengthened tendency towards monism. This standard of reality, articulated as a table of categories or corresponding principles, belongs to the understanding, which, however, has no objects of knowledge apart from those that are sensibly given. Does the strengthened tendency towards dualism suggest an abandonment of the demand for absolute grounding? and thus the strengthened tendency towards monism suggests that only physical grounding is of concern, not its relationship to some metaphysical structure of grounding, which, it turns out, is not epistemically available to us. If so, then it would seem that Kant's Copernican revolution involves a move beyond the Leibnizian problem of trying simultaneously to satisfy the dualistic and the monistic demands. If so, then it would seem that Kant now accepts the Agrippine trilemma as the condition of human knowledge, without, however, becoming an Agrippine skeptic. There is much to recommend such a reading of the Critique of Pure Reason, which ascribes to Kant the third response to the Agrippine trilemma. We cannot escape it, but that is no reason for doubt. Certainly, Kant regards empirical knowledge as grounded in the brute and underivable forms of space and time, as incapable of escaping from the circle of dynamic community, in which every object depends for its determinations on every other object, which in turn depend on the first object, and so on, and also as inescapably driven to infinite regress in its causal explanations. And surely there is no reason to impute skepticism to a philosopher who insists that the epistemic success of the mathematical and natural sciences may be taken as a fact and needs no demonstration, and upon whose genesis he wishes to model his own attempt to set philosophy on the sure path of a science. If one reads the Critique thus, then one will find no overlap whatsoever between its problematic and that of the German idealist, whose derivation monism will be judged pre-critical. However, I want to argue that it remains possible to read the Critique as a response to the Leibnizian problematic, and even to find versions of dependence monism, and within crucial limits, derivation monism, that survive Kant's Copernican revolution. Of course, quite different interpretations of that revolution will be given by those who think the critical Kant gives the third response to the Agrippine trilemma, and those who think that he gives the second response. Everyone will have to agree to some verbal formulas, say that our knowledge is of appearances, not things in themselves, and that the standards of reality and truth by which our knowledge is to be assessed come from the forms of our minds, not from the forms of mind-independent substances. But these words alone do not compel us to abandon the thesis that there are things in themselves with an absolute ground, or even the thesis that physical grounding is somehow derivative from metaphysical grounding. I will argue, however, that these theses can only be ascribed to the critical Kant if their meanings undergo revolutionary transformation. It is in the light of these issues that I want to consider the more familiar questions, more familiar to Kant interpreters, of how to understand Kant's critical dualism between thing in itself and appearance, and most immediately of how to understand Kant's critical use of the term thing in itself. A range of options have been canvassed, which might be arranged as follows, in order of increasing ontological commitment. 1. The two methods interpretation. On this view, Kant speaks of things in themselves non-referentially, and thus without any ontological commitment whatsoever. The point of the distinction between things in themselves and appearances is not to pick out some realm of entities beyond the reach of our knowledge. Instead, the point is to pick out a method for thinking of the very same objects that are accessible to our knowledge, a method for thinking of them as independent of the necessary conditions of our knowledge. But there is nothing metaphysical corresponding to this method of thinking, not even a non-phenomenal aspect of the objects we know. Our knowledge is finite without being confined. There is nothing, no thing, we cannot know. 2. The two aspects interpretation. On this view, Kant speaks of things in themselves referentially, but he's referring to a non-phenomenal aspect of the very same objects that are accessible to our knowledge. Thus, there is something we cannot know, but this something is not an entity distinct from the entities we can know. Here, a further range of options opens up, varying with respect to how much we are entitled to affirm of the non-phenomenal aspects of things. Are we entitled to affirm only that such an aspect exists, or also that it has certain negative characteristics, or even that it has certain positive characteristics? By the way, welcome, Dark Master. If you want to read along, the text is pasted in the philosophy chat channel.
I'm kind of perusing my an in-person friend of mine. His dad just died, so I'm kind of trying to comfort him and focus on that. But yeah, I am kind of looking through stuff.
All right. 3. The two-existence interpretation. On this view, Kant speaks of things in themselves referentially, and he is committed to the existence of entities distinct from the sensible objects of our knowledge. These entities inhabit the intelligible world, which is distinct from the sensible world. Again, a further range of options opens up, now varying with respect to how much we are entitled to affirm of things in themselves. Are we entitled to affirm only that such entities exist, or also that they have certain negative characteristics, or perhaps even that they have certain positive characteristics? Something of interest is people often identify the noumenal and the thing itself, but I have it on good words from people whose knowledge and judgment of such things I put more trust in, and they tell me that that is not a legitimate identity. So noumena and things in themselves are not the same concept. The two methods' interpretations total lack of ontological commitment accords well with the idea that Kant accepts the Agrippan trilemma without skepticism, abandoning the requirement for absolute grounding. For things in themselves cannot supply any such grounding if they do not exist. However, the idea of a method for thinking of things as independent of the conditions necessary for us to know them sounds exceedingly odd. What could be the point of such a method if it does not pick out a way things are independently of the conditions necessary for us to know them? To this question, the third and second critiques enable the following responses. First, the idea that physical grounding is derivative from metaphysical grounding plays an indispensable role in science. This is not because it constitutes objects of possible knowledge. Rather, it is because, as Kant argues in the Critique of Judgment, it gives us hope that a shared absolute ground renders nature and our cognitive capacities fit for one another, without which hope the pursuit of theoretical knowledge would not seem worthwhile, and because it gives us hope that nature has a unity that is at least a pale reflection of the unity we imagine the metaphysical to have, without which hope we would not find it worthwhile to seek ever greater unity in our scientific explanations. However, the reflective and regulative employments of the method involve no cognitive claim whatsoever, hence no ontological commitment to things in themselves, underlying natural phenomena. Second, the method for thinking of things as independent of the conditions necessary for knowledge of them turns out, as Kant argues in the Critique of Practical Reason, to be exactly the right method for practical reasoning, for we have to think of ourselves in this way if we are to act as free agents, capable of morality. However, the practical employment of this method involves no cognitive claims whatsoever, hence no ontological commitment to ourselves as things in themselves. This thoroughly non-metaphysical account of Kant's critical philosophy has recently been developed with great subtlety and elegance. It can account for much that Kant says about things in themselves in all three critiques. However, I do not think that it can account for everything Kant says about things in themselves. There are passages that affirm the existence of things in themselves, seeming to acknowledge some ontological commitment. For example, at the end of the first critique's analytic, Kant writes, quote, "Doubtless indeed there are intelligible entities corresponding to the sensible entities. There may also be intelligible entities to which our sensible faculty of intuition has no relation whatsoever. But our concepts of understanding, being mere forms of thought for our sensible intuition, could not in the least apply to them." Unquote. At the end of the first critique's dialectic, he says, quote, "Thus, if one asks, in respect of a transcendental theology, first, whether there is anything different from the world which contains the ground of the world order and its connection according to universal laws, then the answer is, without a doubt. For the world is a sum of appearances, and so there has to be some transcendental ground for it, that is, a ground thinkable merely by the pure understanding." Unquote. In the second and third critiques, Kant also speaks of our practical self-understanding, our understanding of agency as independent of the conditions necessary for human knowledge, as a practical cognition. If this understanding, along with the moral theology it is supposed to warrant, is wholly without ontological commitment, then Kant should not regard it as cognitive at all. The proponent of the two methods' interpretation may dismiss such passages as residues of Kant's pre-critical past, or as signs that even he is not free from the dialectical illusions he diagnoses. For my purposes, however, it is worth exploring what view emerges if one does not dismiss these passages, and what affinity such a view might have with German idealism. Set aside for the time being the question of whether the in itself is an aspect of the entities available for our knowledge, or whether it is existentially distinct. Can we know of the in itself, as I will say for now, in the service of neutrality, only that it is, or also what it is not, or perhaps even what it is? On this score, there is an apparent conflict in Kant's thinking, for which I am going to propose a resolution that I hope will illuminate Kantian dualism. On the one hand, there are passages that strongly suggest that we can know some positive characteristics of the in itself. Primary among these are texts in which Kant adds an auxiliary consideration to his usual battery of arguments for the transcendental ideality of space. Quote, "Everything in our cognition that belongs to intuition contains nothing but mere relations, namely of places in one intuition, extension, alteration of places, motion, and laws in accordance with which this alteration is determined, moving forces. But what is present in the location, or what it produces in the things themselves, besides the alteration of place, is not given through these relations. Now, through mere relations, no thing in itself is cognized. It is therefore right to judge that since nothing is given to us through outer sense except mere representation of relation, outer sense can also contain in its representation only the relation of an object to the subject, and not that which is internal to the object in itself. It is exactly the same in the case of inner sense. But if, however, I realize, as has been shown in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, that of corporeal nature we cognize nothing other than space, which is nothing at all existent, but rather merely the condition for locations outside one another, thereby for merely external relations, the thing in space, except for the fact that space is also in it, that is, it is itself extended, no effect other than motion, change of location, thereby of mere relations, consequently, no force or passive property other than motive force and mobility, alteration of external relations, is given for cognition." End quote.
Hello?
Hey.
Hello?
Yeah, is it working?
Hello.
Finally. Hey.
What are you talking about with hello, man? Hello. I'm just
Hello?
kidding, I'm just kidding.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. It's just a greeting.
Just reading All or Nothing, page 51. PDF.
Salutations.
It's in the philosophy chat, whatever
Okay.
it is.
Bom dia.
Yeah. I love when Americans know something about other languages.
You falo português.
Omelette du fromage.
You know, I'm friends with Shri, so we used to speak Portuguese sometimes. I'm not fluent though. Anyway.
Okay, I'm gonna reread that paragraph because that was pretty dense. Actually, I'll read both paragraphs because that's pretty dense. Everything in our cognition that belongs to intuition contains nothing but mere relations, namely of places in one intuition, extension, alteration of places, motion, and laws in accordance with which this alteration is determined, moving forces. But what is present in the location, or what it produces in the things themselves, besides the alteration of place, is not given through these relations. Now, through mere relations, no thing in itself is cognized. It is therefore right to judge that since nothing is given to us through outer sense except mere representation of relation, outer sense can also contain in its representation only the relation of an object to the subject, and not that which is internal to the object in itself. It is exactly the same in the case of inner sense. Not sure what he's referring to as inner sense. I know that he aligns space as an external sense and time as a sort of inner intuition, the internal side of that. But I'm not sure he's talking about that. Okay, that seems this paragraph is pretty clear that insofar as intuitions have anything, all they have is the relations of things, but not things themselves. That's only for the understanding to grasp. Those would be the noumena, the substances. But if, however, I realize, as had been shown in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, that of corporeal nature we cognize nothing other than space, which is nothing at all existent, but rather merely the conditions for locations outside one another, thereby for merely external relations, the thing in space, except for the fact that space is also in it, that is, it is itself extended, no effect other than motion, change of location, thereby of mere relations, consequently no force or passive property other than motive force and mobility, alteration of external relations is given for cognition. Okay, so that was actually quite a bit of repetition. Here Kant seems to argue as follows. The in itself must have certain positive characteristics, namely the in itself must have monadic properties. Anything that is given to us through sensibility can have only relational properties. Therefore, anything that is given to us through sensibility is not the in itself. This argument surely presupposes that the in itself is the substantial ground of relational properties, a ground that must have at least some monadic properties, according to a metaphysical principle inherited from the roughly Leibnizian side of Kant's precritical project. On the other hand, there are passages that strongly suggest that we cannot know any positive characteristics of the in itself. Consider, for example, this passage from the end of the dialectic of the first critique, cited above but now given in a longer form. Quote, thus, if one asked, in respect of a transcendental theology, first, whether there is anything different from the world which contains the ground of the world order and its connection according to universal laws, then the answer is, without a doubt. For the world is a sum of appearances, and so there has to be some transcendental ground for it, that is, a ground thinkable merely by the pure understanding. If the question is second, whether this being is substance, of the greatest reality, necessary, etc., then I answer that this question has no significance at all, for all the categories through which I attempt to frame a concept of such an object are of none but an empirical use, and they have no sense at all when they are not applied to objects of possible experience, that is, to the world of sense. Outside this field, they are mere titles for concepts which one might allow, but through which one can also understand nothing. Kant is speaking here of God, the absolute ground of the in itself, not of the in itself grounded in God, which is under discussion in the previously cited passage. But if the categories do not have any non-empirical use that could enable us to say that God is substance, then they surely do not have any non-empirical use that could enable us to say that the in itself is substance. The point is also made more generally here. Quote, if after all this discussion anyone still has reservations about denying the categories a merely transcendental use, then he should test them in any synthetic assertion, such as, quote, everything that is exists as substance, or a determination dependent on it, unquote. Quote, everything contingent exists as the effect of another thing, namely its cause, unquote, etc. Now I ask, whence will he derive these synthetic propositions, since the concepts are not to hold of possible experience, but rather of things in themselves, noumena? Where is the third thing that is always requisite for a synthetic proposition in order to connect with each other concepts that have no logical analytical affinity? That seems weird to me. Everything that is exists as substance, or determination dependent on it. Everything contingent exists as the effect of another thing, namely its cause. I think Hegel shows that well, they don't have an analytical affinity, but they certainly have a synthetic, internal, immanent affinity. It's just, in that propositional form, yeah, it's not expressed that way. What is to be made of this conflict? I propose to resolve it by means of a distinction between two ways in which Kant commits himself to the existence of the in itself. One mode of commitment does not warrant positive characterization, while the other does. To illustrate the first, which I will call the analytic mode of commitment, To illustrate the first, which I will call the analytic mode of commitment, consider the following passages. Quote, we can have cognition of no object as a thing in itself, but only insofar as it is an object of sensible intuition, that is, as an appearance, from which follows the limitation of all even possible speculative cognition of reason to mere objects of experience. Yet the reservation must also be well noted. that even if we cannot cognize these same objects as things in themselves, we at least must be able to think them as things in themselves. For otherwise there would follow the absurd proposition that there is an appearance without anything that appears. I usually don't make that distinction between cognition and thinking, but not sure what Kant means, but I can have some vague intuition of what it might be. And Hegel probably keeps that a bit, but I haven't actually read enough Hegel to see where that distinction comes up. Continuing. But the cause and account of which, not yet satisfied through the substratum of sensibility, one must add noumena, that only the pure understanding can think to the phenomena, rests solely on this. Sensibility and its field, namely that of appearances, are themselves limited by the understanding, in that they do not pertain to things in themselves, but only to the way in which, on account of our subjective constitution, things appear to us. This was the result of the entire transcendental aesthetic, and it also follows naturally from the concept of an appearance in general, that something must correspond to it which is not in itself appearance, for appearance can be nothing for itself and outside of our kind of representation. Thus, if there is not to be a constant circle, the word appearance must already indicate a relation to something, the immediate representation of which is, to be sure, sensible, but which in itself, without this constitution of our sensibility, on which the form of our intuition is grounded, must be something, that is, an object independent of sensibility. Nevertheless, if we call certain objects as appearances beings of sense, phenomena, because we distinguish the way in which we intuit them from their constitution in itself, then it already follows from our concept that to these we as it were oppose as objects thought merely through the understanding, either other objects conceived in accordance with the latter constitution, even though we do not intuit in them, or else other possible things which are not object of our senses at all, and call these beings of understanding noumena. Here the central point is analytic. It is a feature of the concept of appearance that to apply that concept to some existent is to imply that there is some existent to which applies the concept of the in itself, the concept of the ground of appearance that is in some way independent of the appearance. At most, this analytic thesis could yield what Kant calls a noumenon in the negative sense, and any attempt to characterize it positively would be illicit. For example, it would be fallacious to infer that because there must be a ground of appearance that it is in some way independent of the appearance. For example, it would be fallacious to infer that because there must be a ground of appearance that is in some way independent of the appearance, that is, independent of relation to the forms of human sensibility. Therefore, this ground of appearance must be substantial and have some properties that are not only unrelated to the forms of human sensibility, but that are wholly non-relational. Note, however, first that analytic commitment to the in itself involves commitment to a far from negligible negative characterization. The in itself is not spatial and is therefore not material. Second, since this mode of commitment is analytic, it cannot be negated without contradiction, or, as Kant puts it, absurdity. The analytic mode of commitment, I want to claim, represents what has become the absolute necessary level of metaphysics, transformed and emptied of all but existential commitment, but therefore not abolished by the Copernican revolution. For the second, which I will call the synthetic mode of commitment, consider the following passages. Quote, in an object of the pure understanding, only that is internal that has no relation, as far as the existence is concerned, to anything that is different from it. The inner determinations of a substantia phenomenon in space, on the contrary, are nothing but relations, and it is entirely a sum total of mere relations. Substances in general must have something inner, which is therefore free of all outer relations, consequently also of composition. The simple is therefore the foundation of the inner in things in themselves. Above we noted limits of reason with respect to all cognition of mere beings of thought. Now, we can also determine the boundaries of pure reason, for in all boundaries there is something positive. For example, a surface is the boundary of a corporeal space, yet it is nonetheless itself a space. A line is a space, which is the boundary of a surface. A point is the boundary of a line, yet is nonetheless a locus in space, where limits contain mere negations. The limits announced are still not enough after we have found that something lies beyond them, although we will never cognize what that something may be in itself. For the question now arises, how does our reason relate to the connection of that with which we are acquainted to that with which we are not acquainted, and never will be? Here is a real connection of the known to the wholly unknown, which it will always remain. And if the unknown should not become the least bit better known, as in fact is not to be hoped, the concept of this connection must still be able to be determined and brought to clarity. We should then think for ourselves an immaterial being, an intelligible world, and a highest of all beings, all noumena, because only in these things, as things in themselves, does reason find completion and satisfaction, which it can never hope to find in the derivation of the appearances from the homogeneous grounds of those appearances. And we should think such things for ourselves because the appearances actually do relate to something distinct from them, and so entirely heterogeneous, in that appearance always presupposes a thing in itself, and so they provide notice of such a thing, whether or not it can be cognized more closely. End quote. Kant's thinking here may, I believe, be expressed as follows. The requirement that genuine groundings terminate in an absolute is an unavoidable demand of reason. This demand gives rise to certain necessities in the way we conceive the thing in itself, thus to what may be called a conception of the noumenon in the positive sense. On the one hand, this conception is empty as far as theoretical cognition is concerned. No intuition that is possible for us could enable us to apply the conception of any to any object, or even to determine whether it is in principle applicable to any object. But a synthetic judgment is of an object, involving the application of concepts to that object via some appropriate intuition. So we cannot make the affirmative judgment, say, that the in itself is substantial. However, we can and indeed must think that the in itself is substantial. Although empty in the sense of lacking application to an object given its intuition, and therefore falling short of Kant's requirement for a synthetic judgment, this thought has propositional content. And the necessity that links the idea of the in itself with the idea of the substantial, with the idea of a non-relational ground for relational properties, is not analytic but synthetic a priori. If the in itself were not substantial, then there would be no contradiction. But there would be a conflict with reason's demand for grounding that terminates in an absolute. What links the subject and predicate concept is neither conceptual necessity nor intuition, but rather the supposition that there is an escape from the Agrippine trilemma. This supposition is not negligible. We cannot, as rational beings, be satisfied with mere limits of our theoretical cognition, but must determine boundaries. Still, there is a logical possibility that reason's demand could fail to be met. So, to the question about how the in itself is, we cannot answer without a doubt, as we can to question about whether the in itself is. The synthetic mode of commitment, I want to claim, represents what has become of the hypothetically necessary level of metaphysics, transformed and emptied of applicability, but not of meaning and use by the Copernican revolution. Thus we find ourselves in the following situation. At the ground of appearances there must lie the in itself, on pain of logical contradiction. As a matter of absolute necessity, the in itself can be said to exist, but can be given no positive characterization whatsoever, although it can be given certain negative characterizations, since it is not spatial and is therefore not material. However, as a matter of hypothetical necessity, that is, on the supposition that reason's demands are met, which is by definition reasonable, we must think of the in itself as positively meeting reason's demand for absolute grounding. The content of hypothetical necessity may be determined neither progressively from the content of absolute necessity, for the synthetic a priori has been thoroughly severed from the analytic, nor regressively from the structure of the empirical world, for the pitfall of subreption must be avoided. Nevertheless, hypothetical necessity has some content, however thin, and it remains a matter for speculation to which Kant occasionally returns throughout the critical period. Thus, Kant may be seen as responding to the problem that seemed to Leibniz to call for derivability monism. For Kant is still responsive to two demands, which are in apparent conflict. The first is the dualistic demand for a rigorous separation of the physical and the metaphysical, or the sensible and the intellectual. Although the Copernican Although the Copernican revolution leaves a little of speculative metaphysics and denies it the status of theoretical cognition, it does, and in Kant's view must, leave something. So the dualistic demand does not collapse into the demand that the metaphysical be exiled from the foundations of physics. It remains at the same time the demand that the physical be rigorously excluded from the metaphysical realm of the in itself. The second is the monistic demand that every genuine grounding participate in a single systematic unity of grounds, terminating in a single absolute ground. Although the Copernican revolution evacuates this conception of systematicity almost entirely, commitment to the intelligible world, to a grounding that is ultimately absolute, survives. How should the resulting Kantian dualism of the in itself and the appearance be characterized? The two methods of interpretation, I contend, cannot account for either the analytic or the synthetic mode of commitment to the in itself. Which then is to be preferred, the two aspects or the two existence view? Neither. The correct view would be more accurately called the two essences view. Properly understood, it renders the question, two aspects or two existence, unaskable. To understand the two essences view, we need to consider one of the major innovations of the critique of pure reason, the distinction between the transcendental and the empirical. This innovation, hinted at but not developed in the dissertation, gives the Copernican revolution another formulation. Appearances, which are the sole objects of our theoretical cognition, are transcendentally ideal, yet empirically real. In contrast, the in itself is transcendentally real. But what is the import of these terms? Let us first consider the contrast between the transcendental and the empirical. There are two applications of the contrast. The first picks out two kinds of cognition. Quote, I call all cognition transcendental that is occupied not so much with objects, but rather with a priori concepts of objects, b, modes of cognition of objects insofar as this is to be possible a priori. A system of such concepts would be called transcendental philosophy. End quote. Here the contrast is between transcendental and empirical cognition. Empirical cognition, or equivalently experience, is theoretical cognition of objects. Transcendental cognition is cognition of the a priori necessary conditions for the possibility of cognition of objects. For example, transcendental cognition is concerned with a priori concepts of objects or categories and with corresponding principles. Note that although investigation of the necessary conditions of experience counts as transcendental cognition, the possibility is not excluded that there is also an investigation of the necessary conditions of practical cognition that counts equally as transcendental cognition. So it would be imprecise to identify transcendental cognition with cognition of the necessary conditions of experience. Quote, In its second application, the contrast picks out two registers of meaning. Quote, But since the expression outside us carries with it an unavoidable ambiguity, since it sometimes signifies something that, as a thing in itself, exists distinct from us, and sometimes merely something that belongs to outer appearance, then in order to escape uncertainty and use this concept in the latter significance, we will distinguish empirically external objects from those that might be called external in the transcendental sense, by directly calling them things that are to be encountered in space. Unquote. Here the contrast is between two registers of meaning of the further contrast, real versus ideal, or outer versus inner. At a first pass, one might suggest that the contrast between real and ideal is the contrast between that which is independent of us, or that which is mind-independent, and that which is dependent upon us, or mind-dependent. Then, empirically inflected, the contrast will pick out, on the one hand, that which is in space, and on the other, that which is within an individual mind. Transcendentally inflected, it will distinguish between, on the one hand, that which is independent of the necessary conditions of human cognition, and in this respect, mind-independent, and that which is subject to those conditions, or mind-dependent. But more than this can be said. Specifically, consideration of the term real enables more to be said about the use of the verb to be in formulations such as, quote, that which is mind dependent, unquote, and, quote, that which is mind independent, unquote. For it has been pointed out that Kant does not use the term real interchangeably with actual. For example, when in his criticism of the ontological argument, Kant objects that to be is not a real predicate, he does not mean that it is not actually a predicate at all, which might be meant by a contemporary logician who follows Gottlob Frege in thinking that existence statements should be expressed through the apparatus of quantificational, not merely propositional logic. Kant's point is that to be is not a predicate signifying a property that could be properly included in an explication of the reality or substantial being or essence of a thing. In the post-Leibnizian tradition, reality or substantial being or essence is explained within the framework of a metaphysics that seeks to respond to the Agrippine trilemma. Thus, something's degree of reality or substantial being corresponds to its contribution to a genuine grounding that terminates in an absolute ground. As the absolute ground, God is the ens realissimum, for he grounds all things while, as a necessary being, needing no ground outside himself. Among created beings, substances have the most reality, for although they depend for their existence on God, they have essences or complete concepts comprised of properties that enable them to serve as grounds for other properties. Real properties are those that can comprise an essence. However, properties are grounded in a substance that cannot themselves serve as grounds. Repeating that again. However, properties that are grounded in a substance but that cannot themselves serve as grounds may be called ideal. Mental representations are paradigmatic instances, but not necessarily the only ones. Underlying this usage is the assumption that grounding is an asymmetric and context-independent relation that structures a hierarchy. When Kant says that to be is not a real predicate, his point is that no light is shed on the place of something in the hierarchy of grounding when one says that this something is or exists. Such a predication is equivalent to the assertion that something is actual, and therefore actually plays the role in the hierarchy of grounding assigned to it through its real predicates, which comprise its complete concept independently of whether or not it is actualized by God. Okay, so that's interesting. So, as I'm understanding it, what Frank is interpreting Kant to be saying here is that saying something just is, it is it's a sort of it's a contentless thing. It doesn't actually tell us what it is, and in order to know the function that it actually plays or the role that it actually has, we need to know the specification of what it is, merely than just that it is. Which is interesting. In the Science of Logic, Chapter 1 and a bit of Chapter 2, Hegel brings up this critique Kant had of the ontological argument, in which he says Kant is equivocating being in the abstract, the being which just is, and being as existence, where existence does specify a relational content, or rather what could be called a synthetic a priori content to beings, and therefore to say they exist immediately requires that certain relational contents, both relationship to others and relationship to self, be brought into the discussion of the thing. So, Hegel would say, whereas Kant would say that $100 exists, and just saying $100 are possible, doesn't, not even possible. Just saying $100 and $100 exists doesn't make a difference to Kant. And Hegel says, no, that's stupid. Obviously it does. It makes a real difference between whether the fact that I have $100 actually, well, that they exist in that sense, and $100 that just exist in my imagination. And there's the more radical sense of $100 just existing as such, because the existence of $100 requires that an entire social reality be in play, and so that existence is not actually empty. Sure, with the mere concept of existence, we don't say very much, but we do say something that is more than merely being. It does add content. But anyways, that was a tangent. Let me reread the end of that. When Kant says that to be is not a real predicate, his point is that no light is shed on the place of something in the hierarchy of grounding when one says that something is or exists. Such a predication is equivalent to the assertion that something is actual and therefore actually plays the role in the hierarchy of grounding assigned to it through its real predicates, which comprise its complete constituent independently of whether or not it is actualized by God. Okay, so, yeah, saying it is not enough. What we really want to know and what we need to know is the actual properties of substances, and therefore then we will know where they are in the hierarchy of grounding. Continuing. It follows that the contrast between, on the one hand, transcendental reality and ideality, and on the other, empirical reality and ideality, is a contrast between two hierarchies of grounding. The transcendental hierarchy of grounding is appropriate to the in itself. The empirical hierarchy of grounding is appropriate to appearances. Put another way, the contrast between the in itself and appearances is a contrast between two construals of substantial being or essence. This interpretation coheres well with the point that the Kantian dualism of the in itself and the appearances constitutes a response to the dualistic demand and the monistic demand, and ultimately to the Agrippan trilemma. As in Leibniz, there are two orders of grounding, such that one is subject to the Agrippan trilemma while the other is not, and such that the former is in some way dependent upon, and appearance of, the latter. However, the former or empirical order is not phenomenal in Leibniz's sense of the term because it has its own standards of reality, the necessary conditions of human cognition. Thus, the Copernican revolution transforms but does not abolish the Leibnizian duality. It is now possible to see why the question, two aspects or two existence, is ill-formed, only when dealing with existence possessing the same kind of essence or participating in the same grounding hierarchy does it make sense to ask whether two descriptions pick out one existent or two. Kant himself points out that the individuation of appearances, which may involve nothing more than spatial location relative to time, cannot provide a model for the individuation of the in itself, which is neither spatial nor temporal. To ask whether the in itself and the appearance are two aspects or two entities is to presuppose falsely that a single method of individuation and counting may be applied to both the noumenal and the phenomenal. Okay, well, all this makes sense to me so far. What was it? Oh yeah, he calls this the two-essence view. (1.6) At this point, two objections are likely to be raised. The first textual objection is that I have said nothing to account for the passages that seem to support the insistence on one realm of existence by proponents of both the two methods and two aspects view. They These are passages where Kant speaks of the very same objects considered as appearance and as thing in itself. The second philosophical objection is that I have said nothing to explain in what sense appearances are supposed to depend upon things in themselves, a thesis objected to by all proponents of the two methods view and by some proponents of the two aspects view. My response to the second objection will enable me to respond to the first. But this response requires an investigation of the more articulated versions of Kantian dualism available only through the development of an account of the faculties. The Agrippin trilemma enables an elegant sketch of Kant's doctrine of the faculties. Sensibility is the faculty concerned solely with grounding relations subjects with grounding relations Sensibility is the faculty concerned solely with grounding relations subject to the Agrippin trilemma. Understanding is the Janus-faced faculty concerned either with grounding relations subject to the Agrippin trilemma, insofar as it is employed in the determination of empirically real objects, or with grounding relations that escape the Agrippin trilemma, insofar as it is employed in the thought of transcendentally real things in themselves. Reason is the faculty concerned solely with grounding relations that escape the Agrippin trilemma. Finally, judgment is the faculty concerned simultaneously both with grounding relations subject to the Agrippin trilemma and with grounding relations that escape it. Two familiar ways in which German idealists and other post-Kantians interpret Kantian dualism are incompatible with my thesis that Kant, like Leibniz and the German idealist, is responsive to the problem of simultaneously satisfying the dualistic demand and the monistic demand. One approach, pioneered by Karl Leonhard Reinhold, denies in effect that Kant is responsive to the dualistic demand. The other, pioneered by Salomon Maimon, denies in effect that Kant is responsive to the monistic demand. Both of these remarkably influential interpretations of Kant, I am going to argue, are incorrect and misrepresent Kant's doctrine of the faculties, obscuring the relationship between Kantian dualism and German idealism. I just gotta say that Karl Leonhard Reinhold and Salomon Maimon both sound like badass names to me.
Maimon is badass, man. Really.
Yes, it is.
But, just a comment here. The book is interesting, but I wonder if we wouldn't be better served reading actual philosophers. Or just
yeah, but there's only so much time in your life. We can't go through Kant's to his response, the people responding to him, then people responding to those people, then to Fichte, then to Schelling, and then to Hegel. Hegel already takes up my entire life.
Like, it would be so cool to read Fichte with you guys.
Fichte is good.
I always came out of a Fichtean text like loving life. The guy is able to make me feel very, very good.
Yeah,
but anyway, please continue.
I do see value in these books, insofar as this gives you some kind of view of the historical background without having to spend your life on the historical background. Although personally, I don't place much weight on having this second-hand overview of things. I don't get how certain people who study philosophy can read a book like this and say, oh yeah, and then they go and they're like, oh, Kant says this. Oh, Fichte said that. And the real problem of German idealism was this, because, they read this fucking book. That to me is just fucking, like, dumbass egotism.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's how I see most philosophy students, even graduates, work that way.
Yeah, because this is the kind of book they are reading. I think his point here is very interesting, but at the same time, I feel that he's very pedantic. I don't know.
Well, it does give you some insight into what's going on. It's just, when you read something like this, you just have to keep in mind that this does not what is it? This does not replace the need to actually read the originals and understand it yourself.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this is one historical account of what's going on. There are other people who make their own historical accounts of what's going on. You know, like Pippin has his own book. Is it Pippin? No, Pinkard. Pinkard has his own history of what the German idealist movement was. There's quite a few books, actually, on that whole thing. There's that other book, what is it, the 20 years or 25 years of philosophy, you know, which is just about, you know, philosophy is that. Yeah.
I think his insight on the importance, the pivotal importance of the skeptical challenge, Agrippan trilemma, as he called it, right, is very interesting. It's very interesting indeed, and I've always thought about that too. You know, like the German idealists, they were trying to, in a sense, answer to the skeptical challenge, the ancient skeptical challenge. And we're not talking about pseudo-skepticism, contemporary pseudo-skepticism. We're talking about those dudes who said either you have a fundamental absolute ground to what you're saying, or I have no reason to believe you, right?
Yeah. The
this
title of the book is good. All or nothing.
What?
It's all or nothing. It's in the title of the book. It's all or nothing.
But for example, I would prefer to be reading like Schelling account of the efforts of German idealism. You know, I sometimes feel like that those historicians of philosophy, they're kind of arrogant in a sense, because they're saying, oh, because Schelling didn't understand Kant. Who said so? You? You said so? You don't have any fucking over it, which could be considered to get into the tips of Schelling's toes, and you're telling me that Schelling actually got Kant wrong? Also, you know what I mean? Like sometimes I think that we're losing time with those books, man.
Well, no, I mean, I think there's something valuable in people realizing that, you know, it's like people like, oh, well, Hegel says this about Kant, and then they're like, okay, well, I don't need to read Kant. Or Hegel said this about Schelling, you know, the little quips, and that's it. Or Schelling said this about Hegel, and well, Schelling was very smart. They do misread each other, but it doesn't matter.
That's another story. But for example, I think you've read that essay on freedom, Schelling. I think that's much more interesting and deep account of what German idealism is all about than this, you know.
In a sense, I mean, it's like, more interesting in the sense that it's actual philosophy. You know, like here, this is a very formal account.
Academic fights, not for ideas, but for books and interpretations. I don't know. Like people usually tell me that I ignore those kinds of things, that I'm being arrogant and stuff like that. But I prefer to read actual philosophy than
those people,
like historicians, philosophers. You know, like I don't know, but I don't know why I'm bringing this up.
Well, no, I mean, like, okay, like people who are like, oh, you know, what about so and so says? Well, what about it? Well, so and so says this, yeah, and. You know, somebody asked earlier on yesterday on Reddit, you know, what is the consensus on like Jay Bernstein's interpretation of Hegel? And I'm like, well, go listen to lectures. I like him. I love him. He's a really entertaining lecturer. You know, if I could take a class, I would take a class with him because he's great. He's great at lecturing. Is he a good Hegel interpreter? Hell no. He's awful. He's one of the worst. But I don't care. Because if his stuff makes sense to you, what's bad about that? Oh, well, you know, I can't claim that I'm a Hegelian. Instead, I have to say I'm a Bernsteinian. So?
Yeah.
And, you know,
sometimes I feel like I am more Winfieldian than Hegelian, actually.
Yeah, and I told that person, like, why do you care? I mean, I understand that this is the pressure students feel, in which, like, oh, I gotta do something, I gotta pretend that I know this philosopher, despite the fact that my teachers know that I know there's no way I can fucking know it. But for some reason, people
Yeah,
still have the pressure of, like, you have to pretend that you know it. And I'm like, look,
yeah,
go and listen to Bernstein. If you like his stuff, go with it.
yeah,
But there's a difference
yeah,
between that and, like, I listen to Bernstein and I don't go and ask, like, what is everybody else saying? Does Bernstein get it? Who's the recognized expert? What the fuck does that matter? In philosophy, that doesn't matter at all, because philosophy is about you cognizing things. If you don't cognize it, if you don't think it, it doesn't matter who says it. It doesn't matter how many people say it. They may be
yeah.
wrong.
Yes, yesterday after we talked about Christian Wolff, I went on and I downloaded his preliminary discourses on philosophical science, and he begins by dividing three kinds of knowledge: historical knowledge, which is basically knowledge of facts, right? Philosophical knowledge, which is knowledge of reasons, and mathematical knowledge, which is knowledge of quantities, right? And there is this very interesting paragraph in which he says, when you say that philosopher X says epsilon, that doesn't mean that you have philosophical knowledge. You have historical knowledge of the fact that philosopher X said epsilon. You know what I mean? And I
Yep.
think that's where people get it wrong, And he says the same about mathematical knowledge. He says, well, you may know how to use a certain mathematical equation, but if you are not able to derive it from prior principles, you only have a factual knowledge of it, historical knowledge of it. I think that's what people mistake philosophical cognition with historical memorization. Oh, but Zizek said this, or Dingin said that. So the fuck what, dude? We want reasons. We don't want fucking facts. Of course, we need facts so we can explain them through reason, right? But like the fact that you know that certain philosopher said so and so doesn't mean that you were able to follow up the derivational process of that fact, you know, of that sentence, of that idea.
Yeah, yeah. And that's certainly true. I mean, and that's what these books. I don't think these books are a waste. I think this stuff is interesting. It's not what you should focus on, but in case like you don't actually want to go through like all of it yourself, it gives you some kind of bearing into like, okay, this is sort of one way to see how like these things tie together. And so long as you are open to the fact that it doesn't justify you say that this is what really ties it all together. It's good. It gives you some kind of. Not only is it sort of a historical knowledge of some facts, but there are arguments going on here. They're not very interesting arguments in the way that a real philosophical text is interesting, because you're just kind of being led in a very strong fashion. You're not being given room to think, which is what sucks about all secondary texts, as far as I can tell, no matter which they are, because insofar as they're secondary texts, they can only tell you what to think, and you don't really have room to think, really, which is why I find secondary literature to be quite boring for
The
the most
irony
part.
here is that, and I don't know if it was in his preface, Kant says, I'm not disputing here what author X or Epsilon said about this or that. What I'm trying to do is give an account of reason itself, not of what other authors said about it. And here we are.
Yep. Like I said, I think there's a value in this. I think there's a value in people say like Zoran is a big person on this. Like he's all about, well, there's a difference between so and so has a project and their interpretation of everyone else, and the interpretation of the tradition as a whole, in light of what they view their project to be and what the project actually is. and how that
Yeah, but
gives
there
them a
is always this
theological account.
presupposition that he's getting it better than them. You know what I mean?
Well,
There's
because I
always this
think
idea that
they're
he's flying over them, and they're all dead dogs, so they can't even answer him. You know what I mean? It feels like a
well,
zombie-like activity.
not really, because the way he does it and what he says, I think, is just trivially true. There's a difference between you have your own project, which it may be true that your project may be more foundational, more general, more true to the goal of philosophy, if you believe there is a goal to philosophy, which obviously
Well,
I do.
if you have the criteria of what philosophy actually is, which itself is a philosophical problem, which can only be dealt with believing that there is such a thing as something, a subject matter called philosophy, which is not reduced to texts, you know?
Yeah, and so and Zorn's whole thing is
But I don't.
just like there's a difference between that and you going and putting words on another philosopher's mouth, and I
Yeah,
think that's
that's true.
true.
That's the huge problem here, That's a huge problem here. Like people go around saying, "Oh, because Hegel said this and said that." What the fuck, man? What are you talking about? These days, I was talking to a guy, and he said that Marx had a Darwinian evolutionary perspective about society. And I was like, can you please tell me the paragraph from which you took that out? And the guy was paralyzed. He couldn't, you know? Like, and I told him, stop wasting your time, dude. Like, if you were to make such a general, such a fucking strange claim about Marx, please do have with you the part in which Marx actually said that, in a sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
In that
Yes.
respect, I agree completely with you. But sometimes I also feel that as philosophy has become a subject matter in academia, it has become like the playground of a bunch of people addicted to texts. They don't want to
Addicted
think.
to
They
quote.
want they want to read, and they want to cross references, and like
Yeah.
philosophy is not philology, man. Go study philology if you want to ascertain the exact meaning of that word in that context. That's not philosophy. That's philology, man. You know,
Yep.
and people are usually confusing philosophy with talking about philosophers. No true philosopher believed that. No true philosopher believed that. In 2,000 years of history, no true philosopher believed that. They thought they were dealing with something which had its own objectivity, and they thought that they were not simply discussing and crossing references within a huge text tradition. They think they were thinking like the subject matter itself. So sometimes this idea of trying to reduce philosophy to these debates about interpretation and stuff like that actually puts you out of the real world, which is trying to think things through, because the interpretational polemics are fucking infinite, you know it's too much, man. And we know here that in philosophy there's not so much like real philosophical books, right? We could count on our like the fingers of our hands, and maybe count in feet and our toes, like the true philosophical works that emerged in the history of humankind. So go read that, you know. But anyway,
yeah, yeah. Uh, but I think you're kind of being
I,
uncharitable to Zorn, for example, in which like Zorn still believes there is such a thing as like genuine philosophy that you do. It's not just history philosophy, but he makes a big
wait,
distinction
that
between.
yeah, let me be clear here. I am not projecting this position to him, like in general. I've seen him being pedantic, and I'm fine with that. The man is good. Come on, the man can think. We all know the man can think. I'm not saying that his general approach is that. Actually, I'm very curious about his work, philosophical work. I would like he could. translate some stuff to English and stuff like that. But you know, it's not about Zorn. It's not about Zorn. I don't want to mess around with him.
Yeah. But anyways, to me, I mentioned him just because to me he's an exemplar of what, if you're going to be doing historical philosophy or history of philosophy, in the most precise sense, in which you're not trying to impose an overarching unity, and you're just trying to go look at the internal unities of each philosophy for itself, to whatever extent it might be possible. And there's always going to be disputes about, interpretations, but those disputes are internal to the very tradition itself.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then
the historian of philosophy, he's always put himself out of it, in a sense. He cannot help to do it. He needs to believe that his own hermeneutical tools are, in a sense, out of any philosophical dispute. Otherwise he's going to do philosophy instead.
Well, no, I mean, you're doing philosophy. It's just you're following the philosophy of someone else, and the whole point is just like Hegel. You got to follow the concept. If you're bringing in your own bright ideas, what's the point? You're supposed to be learning from these people. You're not supposed to be like.
Truly, I learned a big lesson with Zorn. That's for sure, and he's right on that. Which is a very trivial lesson. It's basically saying, don't talk about what you don't know, motherfucker, and don't put words into other people's mouth.
Right. But I think people forget that there's also the sense in which, like, I think the reason he harped on it for a while is simply because he's tired of people talking out of their ass about things they don't know because they fall in with someone else. If you fall in with Heidegger, like Heidegger's like whole thing about the forgetting of the question of being, and Zorn responds to that is like, what the fuck are you talking about? People were talking about being since Aristotle. Like, nobody ever stopped. It's literally just false. And so people make up stories about the very history they're supposed to be critiquing, just like how Heidegger and so that's where the accusations of misreadings come from, and like willful misreadings and willful ignorance. There are Hegelians, quote unquote Hegelians, who talk shit about other people who they don't fucking read, just Hegel said this, but Hegel also misreads people, and certainly Hegel has his reasons for reading people in a certain way, just as Heidegger has reasons, just as Schelling has reasons. But there is a sense in which one must acknowledge that there's a difference between I have a project, I know what I'm looking for, I find what I'm looking for, I bring that into my project, I critique it, I integrate it, whatever. And this person had their own project, and if I were in conversation with them, or if that person, Hegel was in conversation with Plato would not recognize Hegel. Aristotle wouldn't recognize Kant, or even Spinoza maybe. These people would be like, no, they have their own projects. And their own projects end up being, of course, yes, incoherent in the end. Everyone's project ends up being incoherent in the end for just necessary reasons of rationality. So one just has to respect those differences to a certain extent. But I completely agree with you that there's a point in which, like, if you have the criterion, you don't care. You don't care whether Kant agrees that you understand him or not, because you have the criterion. It's not what Kant says, it's what is internal to Kant's reasoning that matters. Doesn't matter what Kant thinks matters.
Yeah, it's a complicated field.
Yeah, anyways, that was a big digression, but that was good anyways. Are we finally, judgment, continuing. Two familiar ways in which German idealists and other post-Kantians interpret Kantian dualism are incompatible with my thesis that Kant, like Leibniz and German idealists, is responsive to the problem of simultaneously satisfying the dualistic demand and the monistic demand. One approach, pioneered by Karl Leonhard Reinhold, denies the effect that Kant is responsive to dualistic. Got rid of that. Baddest names. It is helpful to begin with Maimon because his response to Kantian dualism provides a helpful framework within which to situate a range of possible interpretations, and because his remarks show that what is ultimately at stake is Kant's ability to respond to Agrippa's skepticism about empirical cognition. One of Maimon's most suggestive formulations is that the fundamental problem of transcendental philosophy, the question quid juris concerning our right to apply the categories to sensuously given objects, is equivalent both to the question of creation, which was central to the concerns of medieval philosophers like Moses Maimonides, and to the question of the community of soul and body, which was central to the concerns of early modern philosophers like Descartes. As Maimon explains, quote, the question of the explanation of the unification of soul and body is reduced to the following question. How is it conceivable that forms a priori should agree with things given a posteriori? And the second question is reduced to the following. How is the coming to be of matter, as something merely given but not thought, conceivable through the assumption of an intelligence, since they are indeed so heterogeneous? Unquote. Maimon takes the question quid juris to be primarily the question. How is it possible to apply forms of intelligibility to given matter? Good question. Just continuing the aside that we had. I think part of what the value of texts like these is it's a great place to find other interesting thinkers that you otherwise wouldn't be looking out for because you don't know that you have to look at them out for. Because, like, for example, when I read the, White's book on Schelling, because of his book, I wanted to read Leibniz because he had some short sections on Leibniz where, like, it was some bomb arguments, and that hooked me in.
Yeah. You're right. I think I was being too tough before.
Likewise, what is it? I read another book. Maybe it was that one. No, it wasn't that one. Some other book, and I've been reading some other stuff about Spinoza. And usually, Spinoza seems pretty simplistic. The fundamental concept is very simple. But when I encounter like little things here and there in other books that I'm reading, and they bring up these juicy little bits, and it just makes me want to go read it.
Little bits, yeah. The selection is very cool. Yeah, the work of selecting those killer quotes. But it's interesting that those selections can also lead to that kind of caricature that you were talking about, right? Like when I was studying philosophy in university, I noticed that I didn't need to read any fucking book. I just need to understand which quotes were being like were structuring the interpretation of my teacher, And if I read like those 7-8 quotes deeply, I could pass easily. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And then when you go to the actual text, you start to find like very, very interesting quotes which are not at all considered by the tradition, right? The historical tradition of philosophy. Because in the end, the historians always win, right? They always have the last word. Oh, this happened. I don't know. And Descartes was this, and Spinoza was that, and here is my really carrying of bad ideas that you must somehow learn to pass the exam.
Yeah, I mean, just the way philosophical quote unquote schooling happens now destroys actual philosophical thinking.
They want you to study the critique of pure reason in 6 months.
Yeah, I hate stuff. I hate stuff like that. I don't even know why bother having
in
those.
Winfield's lectures is that he actually goes through the whole fucking book, right? With you.
Yeah. Like Zorna was describing his university education, and it's totally not. It's what are called? It's not survey courses. which are what you get in analytic departments, for example.
Yeah.
Where you read you read abstracts from philosophers, whereas what seems
you read
to be
a textbook, a book of texts.
Yeah, and whereas what you get in what you got in more classical education was like you're going to take a class on Kant, and you're going
Primary
and it's
source.
going it's going to be primary source. Not only that, it's like a 1 year to 2 year class. Like that's in most like universities here unheard of.
Yeah.
You're not going to take a 2 year class. Like that's crazy. But over there, that's the norm. And he said, you take a 2 year class, you closely read the text on every session. It's not left to just like, oh, well, read this on your own, and we'll talk a little bit in class, and then write a fucking essay. He was like, you read the text very closely, and it's not on, and like you're discussing in class very closely. The teacher's reading along with you very closely on certain like very key passages that are problematic for people.
Yeah,
and it's not until like the last quarter of that class that you get to even say your own fucking opinion of what's going on. Before that, you shut up and just read.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. Yeah. That really reminds me of Hegel's lectures, right? He was that there is a lecture in which he says that something like, I like the idea that monks, when they get into their associations or whatever, they need to shut up for 3 years before they speak.
Yeah, I've seen that quote around. Actually, there's a great quote by Maimon later here. Now, Maimon famously claims that the question is simply unanswerable on the Kantian assumption that, quote, sensibility and understanding are two wholly different sources of our knowledge, unquote. However, he says the question is answerable on what amounts to a twofold assumption, ascribed by Maimon to Leibniz and Christian Freiherr von Wolff. The first assumption, as Maimon puts it in the Versuch, is that or is it Versuch? I forget this, like CH is in German. Versuch. Versuch, okay. Is that the cognitions of sensibility and understanding flow from a single source and differ only in degree of completeness, or as Maimon puts in his commentary to Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, quote, the understanding and sensibility are not things distinct from one another with a real distinction, but rather with a merely formal distinction, unquote. Sounds Spinozan. The second assumption is that our finite intellect is, quote, exactly the same as, unquote, an assumed infinite intellect, quote, only in a limited way, unquote. Or as Maimon puts it in his commentary, quote, the difference between the infinite intellect made to be exalted and our intellect is merely formal, unquote. What is at stake should be clear in light of my earlier discussion. Maimon worries that Kant is committed to two wholly distinct kinds of grounding, one subject to the Agrippan trilemma and the other not. But there can be an adequate answer to Agrippan skepticism only if a kind of grounding that is subject to the Agrippan trilemma can be shown to be derivative from some kind of grounding that escapes the trilemma and terminates in an absolute ground. So adopting a version of Kant's transcendental method, Maimon wants to show that a certain kind of grounding that terminates in an absolute ground, whose details do not concern us here, is a necessary condition for the knowability of sensuously given objects. For my purposes here, what is important is Maimon's invocation of the scholastic doctrine of distinctions, which he uses to frame his difference from Kant, not the details of Maimon's own position. For that doctrine provides an extremely useful framework for the discussion of Kantian dualism, of misunderstandings of that dualism, and of alternatives to it. A real distinction, the sort of distinction that Descartes sought to demonstrate between body and mind, is a distinction between terms that are intelligible independently of one another, such as distinct substances, or modes of distinct substances. When Maimon speaks of formal distinctions, he may mean either modal distinctions or rational distinctions. Two terms are modally distinct if one is unintelligible without the other, but not vice versa. For example, a mode may be unintelligible without reference to the substance of which it is a mode, but the substance may be intelligible without reference to the mode. Two terms are rationally distinct if each is unintelligible without the other. For example, a substance is intelligible only with reference to its essence and vice versa. If, like Maimon, we are going to apply this set of distinctions to Kantian faculties, then we must make a crucial further distinction which, unfortunately, is not drawn by Maimon or by Reinhold, or, for that matter, by many others. Namely, we must distinguish between distinctions between faculties, that is, capacities, and distinctions between exercises of faculties, that is, actualizations. Now, any interpretations of Kant's account of the faculties should satisfy both the following desiderata. The first desideratum is that each of the faculties considered in the first two critiques, sensibility, understanding, and reason, must have a distinctive exercise, by means of which is a distinctive a priori principle. By means of which its distinctive a priori principle can be discerned. Thus, sensibility finds its distinctive use in geometry, understanding in logic, reason in practical deliberation with the categorical imperative as its highest principle, and judgment in aesthetic judgment. I assume that he doesn't mention that sensibility may find a distinctive use in music theory, mainly because there wasn't much of a music theory and isn't much of a music theory even nowadays. But there could be.
Mm-hmm.
The second desideratum is that the possibility of some collaborative exercises of faculties must be guaranteed. Most famously, experience is possible only if it is guaranteed that sensibility and understanding can be exercised collaboratively in synthetic a priori judgments. This does not mean only that we must necessarily presuppose such a possibility as a condition for the possibility of experience. It means also that there must be a necessity in the collaboration itself. Anything that can be given through sensibility must necessarily be subject to the categories, that is, to the fundamental concepts of the understanding. Maimon and Reinhold exemplify two ways of misunderstanding Kantian dualism by construing one of the desiderata in a way that makes the satisfaction of the other impossible. Maimon thinks that since Kant is committed to distinctive uses of faculties, he must be committed to really distinct faculties. If this were so, then one could have sensibility without reason and vice versa, and one also could have understanding without reason and vice versa. Then Kantian dualism would be comparable to Cartesian dualism. We would have a sensibility insofar as we are corporeal beings, and understanding insofar as we are rational beings. And it would be extremely difficult to see how human beings with both faculties could constitute substantial unities. Indeed, we might well conclude, as Maimon does, that the second desideratum cannot be satisfied. Hence, the problem of the transcendental deduction cannot be solved on Kantian assumptions. But the mistake here lies in the inference from distinctive exercises to really distinct faculties. For there is no contradiction in the thought that faculties that are modally or rationally distinct may have distinctive uses. Indeed, there is no contradiction in the thought that modally distinct faculties may have really distinct uses. Reinhold thinks that since Kant is committed to necessary collaborations of faculties, he must reject exercises of faculties that are more than rationally distinct. Although Reinhold takes himself to be defending Kant's views, he in fact renders impossible the satisfaction of the first desideratum, and he distorts Kantian dualism into a kind of monism. Thus, on Reinhold's interpretation, things in themselves are not thinkable yet unknowable, as they are for Kant. Instead, things in themselves are unthinkable and incomprehensible, and therefore, by a trivial inference, unknowable. For Reinhold does not leave room for distinctive use of either understanding or reason that could yield either a negative or a positive conception of a noumenon. How, then, should Kant's own view about the relationship between sensibility and understanding be characterized? Certainly, each of these faculties must be accorded its own distinctive use. But as I have said, this is not sufficient to foreclose any of the possible distinctions between the faculties. However, satisfaction of the second desideratum, the project of transcendental deduction, rules out, as Maimon sees, the possibility of a real distinction between the faculties. So the distinction must be either modal or rational. I will argue that it is modal. Now, in section 26 of the B edition, Transcendental Deduction, Kant says that the unity of the formal intuition of space was ascribed in the transcendental aesthetic merely to sensibility, quote, merely to sensibility only in order to note that it precedes all concepts, although to be sure it presupposes a synthesis which does not belong to the senses, but through which all concepts of space and time first become possible. unquote, and through which, quote, the understanding determines the sensibility, unquote. He also says that, quote, it is one and the same spontaneity that there under the name of imagination and here under the name of understanding brings combination to the manifolds of intuition, unquote. Here Kant describes primacy to understanding over sensibility, for it is the former that determines the latter, not vice versa. In addition, Kant offers what he claims to be a strict deduction of the determinate forms of judgment, while offering no such deduction of the determinate forms of sensibility. This suggests that a finite rational being essentially has a discursive understanding with determinate forms of judgment, whereas, while such a being must have some faculty of affection, it is neither essential nor necessary to have our forms of sensibility, space, and time. We must distinguish between receptivity in general and specifically human sensibility. Discursive understanding is rationally distinct from sensibility in general, for we cannot make discursive understanding intelligible without reference to receptivity in general, although no reference to specifically human sensibility is required, and we cannot make receptivity in general intelligible without reference to discursive understanding. However, discursive understanding is modally distinct from specifically human sensibility, for we can make discursive understanding intelligible without reference to specifically human sensibility, but we cannot make specifically human sensibility intelligible without reference to discursive understanding. It is on this last point that Kant's resolution of the transcendental deduction problem ultimately rests. Just looking how much more is there to this. Okay, not much more. However, to say in this sense that understanding determines sensibility is not to say that the forms of specifically human sensibility, space and time, can be derived from the forms of understanding. Such a derivation would be impossible, Kant thinks, because, as we have seen, through forms of the understanding alone we can think things in themselves, which, supposing reasons demand to be met, must constitute non-relational grounds for relational properties. But through the forms of specifically human sensibility, the only objects that can be given are nothing but relations, objects that are what they are in part because of their careers within the relational framework of space and time. There is no possible derivation from forms of understanding, that is, from conceptual forms, either of synthetic a priori truths about space-time, the space-time framework, such as the truths that render it Euclidean rather than non-Euclidean, or the natures of the objects that are what they are within that framework. Unlike the forms of the understanding, which are necessarily determinate and hence the same for any species of finite rational being, the forms of sensibility, and hence the forms of finite intelligibility, which express guaranteed collaborations between understanding and sensibility, that is, the schematized categories, are contingently determinable. In other words, the distinction between understanding and specifically human sensibility is modal but not derivational. Thus, Kant's account of the relationship between understanding and sensibility suggests dependence monism, but not the derivability monism of Leibniz, let alone the derivation monism of the German idealists. Nevertheless, if Kant is a dependence monist, then he is still responsive, like Leibniz and the German idealist, to the problem of simultaneously satisfying the dualistic demand and the monistic demand. But this overlap is problematic. This overlap in problematics is lost on Maimon and Reinhold, which, along with those who follow them. The real distinctions between the faculties that Maimon mistakenly ascribes to Kant are incompatible with the monistic demand. However, Maimon himself repudiates this real distinction, so Maimon's own attitude to the fundamental dualism remains untouched by what has been said here. Reinhold, however, affirms the rational distinctions between the uses of the faculties that he mistakenly ascribes to Kant. These rational distinctions are surely incompatible with Kant's doctrine of faculties, since, I have claimed, Kant's first critique faculties are faculties only insofar as they have really distinct uses. More generally, these rational distinctions seem incompatible with the dualistic demand. But does that entail that Reinhold cannot inherit Kant's dualism in any way? It entails at least that he cannot inherit it as a dualism between two orders of grounding. For if there is no use of the understanding that is really distinct from any reception through the senses, then things in themselves are not merely unknowable, but unthinkable. Indeed, Reinhold seems committed to a dualism between the intelligible and the unintelligible being the proper object of faith. As we shall see in Chapter 4, Fichte's central criticism of Reinhold's pioneering version of the German idealist project is that it fails to adequately acknowledge the crucial dualism of the empirical and the transcendental. Reinhold's position is opposed to Kantian dualism, but it has not yet been shown that German idealism in general must inherit this hostility. The overlap between the the problems to which Kant is responsive and those to which both Leibniz and the German idealists respond has been lost on dominant traditions of Kant interpretation in both the Anglo-American and continental sides of the divide. For they have seen themselves as forced to choose between a real distinction between the faculties mistakenly ascribed to Kant by Maimon and rational distinctions between the uses of the faculties mistakenly ascribed to Kant by Reinhold. Since, as Maimon is the first to argue, the former view makes it impossible to solve the problem of the transcendental deduction, sympathetic interpreters have proposed various versions of the latter. Still, it will be said, despite the overlap of problems, a fundamental difference between the responses remains. After all, Kant is committed only to dependence monism and rejects the derivability monism of Leibniz, let alone the derivation monism of the German idealists. This is true if derivation monism is concerned with the relationship between understanding and sensibility. However, I am going to argue that there is a version of derivation monism to which Kant himself is attracted, a version that concerns the relationship between reason and understanding. Alright, we've been going for an hour and a half. I think it's a good place to stop. For those of you listening... Oh, you got something to say?
America. My name is Iremio Zayfrimbong, and I'm here to you live. That's it.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, go watch Iremio Zayfrimbong, the funky academic on YouTube. A good Hegelian. Yeah, a good Hegelian, and better than a good Hegelian, a good human being in the most high sense of that word.
A subject.
Yeah, a real subject. Trying to improve the world rather than sit on his ass and preach about abstract things. I mean, he does preach about abstract things, but he teaches about abstract things in a concrete way such that regular people who aren't philosophy nerds like us find a way to think, are not only able to understand these abstract concepts, but are able to see how these abstract concepts really concretely apply to them and serve a purpose in their practical lives.
Yeah. And
So,
drop
yes.
some coins to the man, if you have it.
Yeah. So anyways, for those of you listening, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Not much commentary this time, but this tends to happen with psychedelic literature. There really isn't much to say, quite frankly, after a certain point. Because all that it is just, well, you're being told, well, this is a structure of this is a structure of this. This is what follows, and you're following along, and what else is there to say? Not much. Anyways, see you around.